Thanks, Gina. Um, so I want to thank you for joining us for this presentation and discussion today, Inclusive Leadership to Advancing Equity, Part 2. And it's hosted by ACRL Instruction Section's Management and Leadership Committee. And I'm Clarence Mabey, and I am the W. Wayne Booker Endowed Chair in Information Literacy at Purdue University. And I wanted to also mention my co-planner in putting this session together is Stephanie Crow, and she's the coordinator of Liaison Librarian Services at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And unfortunately, Stephanie couldn't be with us today, but I wanted to make sure that I recognized the work that she put into putting this together. Let's see. So the reason that this session is part 2 is because we had an earlier session with Mark, and people asked so many questions. We had such a rich discussion that we kind of didn't get through all of the things, all of the content. And so we asked Mark, and many people in the chat asked Mark if he would consider, kind of keep going with us and doing a part 2. And so that's the session today. If you're joining us for the first time, I'm sure that you'll get a lot out of the session without having attended the first part. And there is a video of that that we could put a link up to if you wanted to see the first part 1. But today, kind of keep going. Mark's gonna, talk about inclusive leadership to advancing equity, moving on from what we talked about in the first session. So I'm going to say a few words about Mark, and then I'll turn it over to him. Mark Puente is the Associate Dean for Organizational Development, Inclusion, and Diversity, also at Purdue University. So he recently, joined Purdue, where I have been for several years, and it's a great pleasure working with him every day, I should say, and I'm learning a lot from him. So it's very exciting to have him with us here today. And many of you may know him from some of his work before he came to Purdue. He was the Director of Diversity and Leadership Programs at the Association of Research Libraries, the ARL, and he was there for 11 years. And in that work, Mark did a lot with many organizations and many libraries to develop programs on recruitment and retention and assessing and improving organizational climates and leadership development and racial equity. And so with that, I think it's very clear that Mark has had a sort of pronounced impact on our field. And I think that he has a lot, definitely has a lot to offer us, and as we're learning at Purdue, and definitely to us across the field. So just one little housekeeping item, as Gina had mentioned, Mark will take little breaks throughout his talk, kind of pauses in which he'll answer some questions. And so if you have questions throughout the talk as you're listening, please go ahead and throw them in the chat, and I will try to feed them to him when he takes breaks. And of course, there'll be time at the end for more questions. So go ahead and put them in there, and I'll try to grab them and share them with Mark. If he doesn't answer any of your questions, we are going to share out the chat afterwards, because a lot of people share links, and if there are questions that get unanswered, Mark will try to answer them there as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Clarence, for that introduction. Thank you, Gina, and the good folks at ACRL for facilitating this. And thanks to all of you for being here. I do hope that I will bring something new to you. I know that a lot of you have heard me speak in other contexts at conferences and that sort of thing. And I really do try to the best of my ability to keep the content updated, particularly as I get exposed to new and interesting frameworks and information. I do want to start off as I tend to do these days, thinking about, if I can get there we go. Thinking about the land from which I am presenting today, and the land on that all of you occupy. And I invite you to go to this website, native-land.ca, if you're not familiar with the native tribes that may have that inhabited the land in which you live and work and play and pray and that sort of thing. So and just maybe put in the chat a brief welcome and identify the lands that that you are on at this particular time. I'd like to acknowledge the land of the greater Chicago area where I am today, which is on the traditional territories of the three fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi tribes. The state of Illinois is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members just in the Chicagoland area, and it's the largest and most diverse urban Native communities in the US. And just as a reminder that we do this land acknowledgement. In doing so, we recognize the indigenous peoples who have been the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, living here long before, in my case, Chicago was a city, and many of whom are still thriving today. So all of us who live and work in these territories must ask, what can we do to right the historic wrongs of colonization, of unfortunately, frequently state-initiated violence, and support the struggles of indigenous communities for self-determination and for sovereignty. I'm going to go on a little editorial sort of direction here, just as we start, before we dive into some of the content. But I want to share with you that at the end of the last presentation, I received a bit of a critique in the chat that was of my this contemporary approach to these issues of really focusing on difference. And what's more, focusing on the differential impacts of systemic inequities on, for example, communities of color. This as an intentional strategy to redress these historical inequities. And the idea that that is a flawed way to look at these issues, right? That's something that, in fact, the person that we think of as the one of the major champions of the civil rights era, one of the major champions of non-violent social movements, Dr. Martin Luther King himself would in fact shun. So my immediate reaction to this, I mean, I'm going to be a little bit vulnerable here. I'm going to lean into some discomfort for you, and I'm going to say that I was a little bit defensive about that. But I'm human after all, right? But after thinking about it, and for a little while, I thought I would do due diligence, right, and go back and reread some of MLK's writings, like the full transcript of his very famous "I Have a Dream" speech, that contain numerous references to the persistent racism and the long history of abuse that Black people have experienced in the US and abroad. And also his famous letter from the Birmingham City Jail, and other writings, as well as writings from historians, commentary, and other civil rights activists, some of whom have analyzed the full breadth and depth of King's commitment over time to the civil rights movement. And although there were certainly writings that supported this idea of a colorblind approach to this work, overwhelmingly, there was support for a racially conscious approach, and that King's persistent support of things like affirmative action, like his support of rights for Native Americans and economic justice for African Americans, is much more consistent with a race conscious approach, okay, as opposed to a colorblind approach. There are many examples of this. When we think about the impact of quote unquote colorblind strategies, I think of immediately the California Proposition 209 that in 1996 prohibited race or sex conscious college admissions in the state of California, and really the detrimental impacts that had on acceptance of communities of color within the state of California. So those who disagree with the proposition that the question of race is not, well, let me just go back and, I'm sorry, let me go back and say that I did quite a bit of thinking about this, and I think that, again, that there is a lot of evidence to the contrary, that in fact a race conscious approach, and much of the way that I'm going to be framing our conversation today, is focused on racial equity, and not because we shouldn't care or I don't care about other issues of inequity with respect to sex or gender identity, LGBTQ status, people with disabilities, that sort of thing. But it is a matter of, again, as I mentioned in the first presentation, that this is a way to really redress any kind of inequality and inequity. And finally, I just wanted to quote an article in 1996 by Ronald Turner, who's a former professor of law at the University of Alabama. And he wrote an article entitled "The Dangers of Misappropriation: Misusing Martin Luther King Jr.'s Legacy to Prove the Colorblind Thesis." And I'll just close with this. He concluded that article saying, "Those who disagree with the proposition that the question of race is not one of blindness, but of vision, should search for and rely upon facts and themes that do not misappropriate Martin Luther King Jr.'s legacy. Any such misuse of King as a symbol for colorblindness must be recognized for what it is: a deception, knowing or unknowing, built on misleading sound bites, ahistorical and acontextual analyses, and other fundamentally flawed premises." So I say this not to call out the critique, but just to say that I took this critique very seriously, and I really did a fair amount of investigation. And again, this very much will frame the approach to these models that I'm going to share with everybody starting now. So here we go. Okay, so building an inclusive organization. I want to concentrate basically on two models today. I mentioned these very, very briefly in the last presentation, but this opportunity, I hope, is going to allow us a little bit more time to dive in a little bit more deeply into the details of a couple of these models. And I hope you will find them helpful. And again, much of this framing is around creating inclusion for in this in the model, in the example of this particular model, particularly focused on racial equity. But again, the implications for any kind, any marginalized people from marginalized or underrepresented identities it's applicable in those instances too. So I'll start with a work by two folks, two facilitators who are deeply involved, largely have published a lot around the philanthropic community with respect to philanthropic groups trying to focus their work on equity in general and racial equity in particular. And I cite an article that they published, and we'll share this, but I'll share this with you at the end. But this is a basic framing for what they see as necessary steps for creating an inclusive organization, particularly from a leadership perspective, right? So they say, begin with inclusive behaviors and group norms. We will dive into each of these bullet points as we progress here. They also explore the historical and sustained accumulation of disadvantages and advantages, particularly for those from majority cultures and identities, and be those advantages whether they materialize on individual levels, organizational levels, and or systemic levels. They suggest that organizations develop a common vocabulary around these issues, around equity issues, around diversity, equity, inclusion, specifically racial equity issues, and also provide opportunities to explore and work to counter dominant cultural norms. I'll define that for us as we dive into this and talk a little bit about what the implications are for our practice. And finally, the most controversial suggestion I think that you will find is that organizations find the time and space to caucus by racial identity. Again, we'll dive into each of these as we go forward here. So let's talk about the first bullet point a little bit. I actually shared these as norms for engagement. And there are many, many similar lists, if you will, if you survey the literature. But these are the ones that our facilitators recommend in terms of establishing behavioral norms that will allow for growth and leadership in this space. And one is to speak your truth, right? To speak from the I, from your own experience, and how these experiences and how these issues play out and impact your view of the world and the way you interact with others around you, particularly those from underrepresented or minoritized populations, right? That we lean into discomfort and into each other. I think I mentioned the first time, and we can't say enough that growth often comes with discomfort. It comes with just a little bit of hope, I hope not physical pain. But the second part of that is to lean into each other. And that as we position ourselves and grow the types of culture that will allow us to really listen to difficult stories and to become conversant and familiar with uncomfortable truths, that we lean into each other and that we allow space for emotion, that we allow space within organizations, even within professional contexts, for people to process information and to deal with the emotions that are involved as such. We simply do not take the time to do that as organizations. That we commit to non-closure, right? That we are not going to set up a situation where we expect an answer, right? That the consensus is going to be built in every single instance about every single issue. That sometimes that issues are not necessarily ones that are going to be, so that we're not going to be resolved necessarily, but sometimes that issues are polarities that need to be managed. And so how we do that is to become comfortable with non-closure. It is a deliberately countercultural approach about thinking about non-closure. That we embrace paradox. And if we think about paradox as something, if we just think about the textbook definition of paradox, that is something that is, at first glance, maybe seemingly absurd or in some ways self-contradictory in terms of a proposition, but when investigated a little bit further, really may prove to be well-founded or true. And lastly, that we seek intentional learning and not perfection. Again, it's the goal of perfection is often so immobilizing for us as individuals and as institutions that we want to wait until to roll out a program or to roll out an intervention until we know that the formula is absolutely right. And so these are a set of norms for inclusion that where we create a container where experimentation and sort of draft thinking and articulation is going to be an acceptable part of an acceptable behavior and an acceptable way to approach these issues. Okay. Let me go forward here. This is just another framework, and again, I think I referenced this in earlier in the presentation in February. But I really love this framework that is I've learned through my association with a number of people, Nick Kafagos, who is my co-conspirator in this work at American University. But these tremendous organization development professionals, Frederick Miller and Judith Katz. This literature is freely available, openly available on the web, but they suggest 4 key behavioral elements here. And one we've heard before is to lean into discomfort. And what Miller and Katz actually do is they encourage people to, in fact, use that language when we're going to approach a conversation that is very, very difficult for us, so that we signal to the person with whom we're conversing that that I'm vulnerable. I'm allowing myself to be vulnerable with you. I'm coming to you with this issue. I'm not comfortable discussing this, but it's important, and I value you enough that we need to have this discussion. That we listen as an ally, and we've heard many of these types of sorts of this advice and from other listicles and things like that, right? But that we listen for clarity in the other person's message. That when we listen, that we listen not that we not take that time to prepare necessarily for our response, but we listen to other people to truly understand their position. that you state your intent and intensity. I think this is really a terrific approach, and I invite you to look at the literature that I cited a little bit, this article that I cited a little bit earlier. Miller and Katz, they again encourage us to use specific vocabulary for specific behaviors to demonstrate a commitment that one has toward a notion, toward an idea, right? And they offer 4 different sort of classifications, if you will, that ideas that we have are either notions, or they are stakes, or they are boulders, or they are tombstones. So, and that's on a spectrum, right? Where a notion is just that. A notion is something, I want to throw an idea off of this group, or off of a colleague of mine, to see if there's any resonance here, if there's any opportunity for collaboration and for some common ground to be built. While at the other end of the spectrum are the boulders, right? These are issues that are so fundamental, and values that are so fundamental to me, that if this issue isn't resolved in the way that I feel is appropriate, that I'm actually willing to leave an organization because of that. So again, I invite you to access that literature. I think it's very, very helpful. Also, connected to this is 8 sustaining behaviors. And I think within this context, in terms of providing leadership for creating inclusive organizations, I really like number 6, which is to speak up when people are being are made to feel small or unincluded. Lots of great suggestions there about how to activate this particular model. Okay, I should have given you a little bit of a trigger warning. This is I think the most difficult of all of the suggestions from Gulati Parti and her colleague. So they invite people to look at the accumulation of advantage for majority cultures and identities, and these are things that I have taken from some literature and research from the Racial Equity Institute out of Greensboro, North Carolina. But they're essentially saying we need, as a community, to re-educate ourselves and to think about our history, and to think about the long and sustained implementation of policy, in fact, of laws that have created disadvantage, that have served as tools for oppression of people of color, of women, of whatever that demographic group is. So a lot of these are very difficult. We don't have time to go through all of these, but how so much of this really started in early colonial days. In fact, the concept of race and the concept of race as an identity started in the United States. It started previous to that, but in terms of policy implementation, started in the 1640s. Many historians refer to John Punch, who was actually an indentured servant that was brought over from the African continent, but that was what many historians believe was the first person from the African continent to be punished to lifelong indentured servitude, which is basically slavery. There may have been, again, this is some consensus around historians. But if we look at the historical trajectory of policies, of things like our Constitution, right, and policies that were put in, like the U.S. Naturalization Act from the 1790s, right, from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the interpretation of who was in fact considered a U.S. Was eligible for U.S. citizenship, and how whiteness was actually a criterion for that, and how the Irish, when they first immigrated to the United States, as well as the Italians, as well as many other demographic groups, were not considered white, and therefore were not eligible in those early days of immigration for U.S. citizenship. Things like the Social Security Act of 1935, that in fact allowed for people, most working people, to start contributing to Social Security, except for 2 key employment classifications. And those were domestic workers and farm workers. And if you think about history in those days, in the 1930s, those 2 classifications primarily were populated by people of color, and also at that time by women who were working in the farms. The GI Bill, right? Many people came over from World War II and immediately were able to get access to higher educational grants and housing grants. Who was left out of that? Right? Who was allowed into institutions of higher education in 1944? Right? And who was left out? Right? So primarily, as an example, people of African American descent, primarily Black people, were only allowed to register and to matriculate through historically Black serving institutions. So they did not have equal access. I threw in the subprime mortgage crisis, and of course the global pandemic that we're now experiencing, because again of the disproportionate impact that those two events, even though that they were certainly the prime mortgage crisis was an impact of policy, right, a result of policy, but how the impact of those events differentially affected communities of color, impacted communities of color. So let's just finish this off, and we'll I'll go through these few more slides, and then we'll open the floor up for a couple of questions anyway. Developing the common vocabulary. Many of you probably have seen lists like this. I mean, what is the difference between prejudice and discrimination? And again, not looking for the perfect definition, but at least coming to a reasonable understanding, or at least knowing what resources to go to get definitions, contemporary definitions of those terms. Where prejudice we think is a mindset, we think of as a mindset, as prejudging, whereas discrimination we think of as the transactional, as in fact action, right? What is the difference between, or is it appropriate to call somebody with a disability, to call them disabled, or to call them a person with disabilities, and how that changes over time, right? How do we define social justice and decolonization? Really tricky here. And I, again, sorry, a little bit of a trigger alert here, but can we define the concept of whiteness? And how is the concept of whiteness as a cultural phenomenon differentiated from white supremacy and white supremacy culture? Okay. I know there's a lot of conversation about that. People are using the term white supremacy culture a great deal, but do people really understand the manifestations of that and what those terms mean? And also, what is the difference between racism, systemic racism, which everybody seems to be using these days, and what is anti-racism? So I'm not going to put forward necessarily any definitions here, but again, in terms of providing leadership that allows for building of inclusive organizations, that developing an institutional organizational common vocabulary around these issues is pretty critical. Okay, two more bullet points. Explore and work to counter dominant cultural norms. So we'll explain, discuss a little bit what exactly this means. But when we think about how we go about the work that we do in libraries, archives, cultural heritage, and memory organizations, we do have a set of norms, right? We have a set of cultural norms. Most frequently, these norms are socially and politically constructed, right? These norms are learned. A lot of times they're not real obvious to people who come in from outside the organization and who join our organizations. They are based on an ideology, that is a set of beliefs and values, behaviors, habits, and attitudes. And they often represent a position of power, where in fact the power holder defines who is going to be in the in-group. Power is relational, it's fluid, it is often, quite often, invisible to the holder. And in fact, it can create structural and accumulated advantage for some populations. So these are what we think of quite often as being from contexts that are largely Western European in their focus. I read a lot, and I hope maybe some of you are familiar, and I cite the work of Dr. Tema Okun, who provides lots of really terrific literature around on this issue and what are exactly, white cultural norms or dominant cultural norms, and the explicit ways that norms and preferences and values, and sometimes the fears of majority cultures and identities overwhelmingly shape how we organize our work and our institutions. It deeply impacts how we see ourselves and how we interact with one another, and with time, how we make decisions. So what does that look like? How does that show up in librarianship? And these are some of the manifestations. Um, whose literature, whose science and research empiricism is represented in our scientific, in our historical, in our literary and artistic canon? How much content in our electronic journals is representative of scholars from the global South, right? We all know about representation and staffing and the degree to which at least minoritized populations are seriously underrepresented if we compare those percentages to the broader population, and often the populations that we serve. Um, Rewards are often tied to individualism, right? So there's that sense of the meritocracy, right? That the individual, if they're smart enough, if they're determined enough, can jump over any kind of hurdle, right? So that's a product of this. Overemphasis on perfectionism. We talked a little bit about that and our tendency to not want to really engage unless we think we have the perfect answer, the perfect model, the perfect strategy. The fear of open conflict or the right to comfort, right, is often where that is the priority rather than over really committing to dealing with issues and having difficult discussions about what just happened, or how our cultural norms are differentially and negatively impacting some communities, right? Um, Either or all, and always linear thinking, and of course worship of the written word and a sense of urgency. So those are some of the ways that they show up. Now, here's the deal. Does it mean that overemphasis on perfectionism in itself is a bad thing, is a horrible thing? Does it mean, right, that any of these issues are intrinsically bad? Well, I mean, that's a good question. The problem with most of this is that these are the default norms of how we get things done. The default framework of the organizational cultures in which we operate. And there is never an opportunity to really openly discuss these norms and to negotiate these norms with communities that maybe have a different set of normative expectations than what we are used to. So it's not that rules are bad. It's not that we don't need them, that they don't provide structure for us, that perfectionism is in many ways a positive thing if we're looking at, right, developing a coronavirus vaccine, right? But so there are many positives there. But again, it's that these are without negotiation the fault behavioral characteristics of our organizations. So finally, and then we'll take a break and answer any questions. I realize that this is kind of really meaty and maybe in a lot of ways difficult. Caucusing by racial or other identity. This is admittedly very, very controversial. There was an incident not too recently, I mean, excuse me, not too long ago, very recently, I believe as it was in Northern Michigan University. As a university, they were trying to create space for people to caucus by racial identity and to have facilitated conversations about the racial equity movement from last year. And it was really just, I mean, much maligned. It was characterized as highly racist, very difficult. And so I want to acknowledge that. However, again, in this literature and in other literature, there are these suggestions come up because of the value that they provide for communities, both as communities of color who want to caucus and want to process through some difficulties, process through these historical events and the contemporary context, but also the opportunity for people who identify as white to come together and to process through these events and through these issues without the fear of judgment, right? To process through any guilt or shame that they may have, and to talk constructively about what it is that people from majority cultures and identities can do do to advance, in this case, racial equity. But as I said, these are highly generalizable and very accessible, and ways to approach almost any kind of inequity. So I'll let you kind of read through those. I will take a break and get a little sip of water. And Clarence, do we want to take, we will take a thematic shift, but do we want to take a question or two before we do that?
Sure. So if folks have questions, please put them in the chat and then I'll read them out to Mark.
And again, I share at the end of the program the citation of a particular article that outlines this particular model. Okay, if there's none, I can go on.
All right.
If there are none, okay, go on. Okay, terrific. Okay, so a bit of a change here, just a slight change in direction. So
actually, if you want to,
there is a question. Go ahead. Go
there's
ahead.
a question.
Go ahead. Go ahead. What is that?
Let's see. Here we go. What advice would you give those of us who are working in predominantly white organizations with a majority white admin and staff who are creating these anti-racist task forces and fail to bring in a facilitator to help with these discussions? When the group is majority white, I question whether consensus is needed, since the consensus would rely on the majority.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a fantastic question. And I do think that, you know, what's often missing well, first of all, I mean, how many of us don't work in predominantly white institutions? I mean, that's the nature of higher education. And so we have to acknowledge that. I also don't necessarily want to dismiss just out of hand the expertise, the abilities of facilitation, the commitment to equity that many white people have. I mean, quite frankly, I mean, there are many people who identify as white, who are quite skilled at this. So I think looking for those opportunities, looking for that talent, if you will, within your own organizations is certainly worth investigation. Sometimes they'll come from pockets where you're not expecting, but I do think it is critical. You know, if you can't think about how do you get connected to communities of color without creating unnecessary burden on those communities. But I think that, you know, obviously you can do this through the literature, you can do this through reading. And I do think that, you know, to the degree that you can, and when a group is ready to invite those voices of difference, I think is really critical to all of this. You know, we're familiar with the sort of the nothing about us without us. So again, providing opportunities to engage those different voices are really critical to this work. Okay.
There's one more question if you want.
Okay, let's try.
What would you suggest to a person who is working a 99% white academic library? So there's another question actually about what if you're the only one in the library?
Right.
And then this one, what if working in a 99% white academic library where a person in charge is really hesitant about even the idea of anti-racist action?
Yeah. Well, you know, some organizations just aren't ready for that. There are many organizations that are simply not ready for that. And so I say, again, look for opportunities. What are the access points? There are people within every organization that along a continuum will have, you know, I don't mean to cast aspersions or to be judgmental, but to have a more sophisticated view of what these issues look like. And so finding people that share that interest, that maybe have some expertise, and providing opportunities to have those sorts of discussions are really important, even if the leadership is not there. I don't know. I have seen in my days at ARL, I saw leaders that were very, very hesitant to have these conversations that over a course of time became at least more receptive to that. So that may not be the case in your context. The other thing that I will say with respect to if you're in a 99.9% white organization or institution, these principles still apply, right? Providing opportunities for growth and for learning and for digging into the literature and for thinking about what that looks like, not only with within your institution, but when you go to the grocery store or when you travel outside of your community, even if it's a very homogeneous community, that provides an opportunity and a need really for growth and to develop those perspectives and that cross-cultural proficiency. Okay, I want to move on. Hopefully we'll have a little bit more time to answer a few more questions at the very end. So this is a general framing from this document adopted from Paul Gorski for ED Change in the Multicultural Pavilion. Again, this provides, I think, just a vocabulary, a look at vocabulary, right? Where we go from thinking about equality, which is about the equal distribution of resources to everybody, right? Everybody gets $5, right? As opposed to equity, whereas thinking about what does an individual or what does a group of people need to really succeed and thrive within an organization, within a profession, in a higher education context. That we change our thinking. We're going to dive into this a lot more, that we change our thinking from at-risk or disadvantaged populations to a broken system. It's not the people that are damaged, right? It's our systems that are not, they are not built for access and to ensure the success of every type of individual that goes through our system. Again, that we go from being colorblind or thinking about colorblindness, with the apology for the admittedly ableist language here, but from colorblindness to acknowledging and honoring difference, and some would say to even leveraging difference, right? That we progress from just learning about other cultures, which can be valuable and can be an access point for many people, especially people who are newer to the conversation, to dismantling systems of power and privilege. That we go from celebrating diversity to actually advocating for and fighting for equity within our institutions and even more broadly within our society. And then finally, that we change our focus from intent to impact. That we think about what our interventions, what is the result of our intervention, or what is the result of our behavior. And sometimes we have the best of intentions, and yet we have to be responsible and bear responsibility for the impact, particularly if it was a negative impact on our coworker or on others. So this is a way of thinking about this from the University of Southern California, their Race and Equity Center. There is another group that unfortunately, well, they just got folded into USC's Race and Equity Center that I will reference, but it was called the Center for Urban Education. And it's from their literature. They have a lot of literature, again, freely available on the web, that I cite with some frequency. But if we think about this as a progression from diversity mindedness, that is concerning only demographic representation, right? To ensuring that we have the numbers of whatever demographic group within our organization. So what's missing from this, this is in particular around USC, is related to higher education and to classroom settings and contexts, but I think it's applicable to employees and in many other organizational contexts. That we add diversity to a classroom or to a workspace, we may still experience inequities in success, for example, in retention, for students in graduation, for students in participation in higher impact experiences. That diversity mindedness could result in access, but not necessarily in success in terms of outcomes. And then if we think about growing into this model a little bit, that we get to deficit mindedness. Again, that the explanations for inequities are typically grounded in what those who are underrepresented or racially minoritized, either students or employees, lack, or how they don't exhibit the qualities of a successful employee or successful college students who are the successful ones are all, self-motivated, goal-oriented, efficacious, and professionally and academically prepared. So also the shortcomings of students from, example, minoritized populations are a natural outcome of these students having attended under-resourced schools, growing up, for example, in lower income communities, are coming from families that do not value or have no experience with education. So focusing on these deficits on these individuals implies that higher education is completely blameless in producing and maintaining inequities. So, I mean, this is not to assert that employees or that students play no role in their educational outcomes, but deficit-minded thinking squarely places the responsibility on those people, right? On the people who are different. And reframing the discussion really empowers institutions and allows practitioners to focus on how we can improve policies and practices, in fact, norms and cultures to improve the outcomes of students, employees that work within our organization. And so finally, we get to equity mindedness, which is defined as equitable policies and practices that must target educational institutions and systems and not just the students and employees within those institutions that higher education has not served well. Equity mindedness reflects an awareness of the social historical context of exclusionary practices of whatever ism, whether it's racism or sexism, etc., in higher education, and the impact of power imbalances on opportunities and outcomes, again, for minoritized populations. It really frames racial inequity and other forms of inequity as a dysfunction of higher ed's policies and practices. And it really requires us to exercise our agency and assume responsibility for eliminating those inequities in the outcomes. So that I think I'll stop there, and I'll dive into this last framework. What time are we doing? We're at 4:47. Okay. How do I do this, Clarence? I always intend to get through all of the content, but I just don't. Okay, we don't have time to get through the final model. I will share it with you. Um, because I think it's important. Again, the literature is openly available, freely available. And I think it's something that, in spite of what I think is an unfortunate title of the framework, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. And we talked about this the last time. But this is this particular model. There's a organization, I believe it's out of Washington, D.C. It's called Equity in the Center. And it is built what I think is a tremendously helpful framework called the awake to woke to work model. Yes, I think it's a little bit unfortunate, but and it's built for a slightly different context than higher education institutions, than libraries, cultural heritage organizations, etc. But I still think there's so much applicability in terms of thinking about, as we think about all of these categories around the circle: senior leaders, data, organizational culture, the learning environment, managers of our organizations. Where do we have opportunities to effect change? What are the levers that can be pulled to effect change, and what is the difference across this? Again, it's kind of a continuum that they build, although they were intentional in developing this model in this circular pattern to really emphasize that this is not necessarily a linear journey, right? Or a linear strategy, that these things are interwoven. When you pull on one piece of the circle, it may and will often engage a piece of another piece of the circle. But we'll walk through this really quickly. Yeah, 449. Okay, just very quickly to think about the steps that happen. Again, I'm not gonna read this. We won't go into this in any length other than just to share this model with you and to think about, from these perspectives, from both personal beliefs and behaviors, from the perspective of policies and processes that we engage, and also with respect to the data. What does it look like at a senior level, right, to be in this awake phase, right? To be becoming comfortable with these principles and comfortable with the idea of creating more inclusive and more equitable environments. What does it look like at that middle stage, right? Where we have greater level of commitments, where we have people maybe pushing the envelope a little bit more so that the organizations can think a bit more critically about our policies, about our norms, about the data that we need to gather and to analyze in order to create substantive change within our organizations. And finally, at the senior leaders level, what does it mean to really get to the work, right? So many people come to presentations like this. I've been to many presentations like this. We provide all of this helpful information, helpful frameworks, but everybody asks, okay, what do we do next? And so this framework, I think, is very, very helpful in terms of providing practical on the ground strategies for what this looks like when we're really ready to advance racial equity or any kind of equity within our institution. They have the same framework with respect to what this looks like at a manager's level. I'll just go through these very, very quickly and invite you to go to, again, this is freely available on the web. And then what this looks like at the work level. And finally, sorry, good, because I'm kind of losing my voice here. Um, in terms of leadership and positioning leadership to do this work. This is, again, from Equity in the Center and from this framework. We establish a shared vocabulary. Again, we've heard this so many times, right? Ground your organization, our institutions, in shared meaning around equity, around things like structural racism or sexism and other terms related to this work, right? That we identify racial equity champions at whatever level, right, within our organizations. And this is, I hope, answers that previous question. There are champions within our organizations, and we can select those who can set race equity priorities and communicate them broadly, right? Choose people and find a group of people to align with that can defend that particular strategy and that in fact can drive accountability and influence both the speed and the depth at which equity and inclusion are embedded within an organization. Name this issue, whether it's racial equity or accessibility, whatever that is, name that as a specific strategic imperative for our organizations. Define and communicate how that equity connects to our mission, to our vision, to our organizational values, and to our strategies. Open a continuous dialogue about, in this context, racial equity work, but again, think about the generalizability about that, and use research and learnings from other organizations to start that conversation within your team or individuals who are invested in your organizational cause and mission. And finally, to disaggregate the data, which is a little bit, it's very tricky, particularly in organizations where people from minoritized populations are people that embody identities that are underrepresented or marginalized are so little. But they suggest that we collect and disaggregate reports and report relevant data that gets a clear picture of persons' experiences within our organizations and the inequities and the gaps in outcomes that they experience both internally and externally. So the last was just a tool that if we think about just a tool for analyzing this very, very quickly, I found this to be very, very helpful. It's a quick assessment tool where you just look at a policy, you look at a practice, and you ask these questions. What kind of impact does it have? Does it fit on this continuum? So I think that is all I have. Yes, resources cited today. And I hope we have time for at least a couple of questions.
I think we do. Let's see. One question that was asked a little earlier, but I think is relevant now is, I have been examining the participants of the Minnesota Leadership Institute for Early Career Librarians to the list
Great.
of the senior fellows and ARL leadership fellows. And to my
Yeah.
dismay,
Mm-hmm.
what does it say?
Yep.
Very few, right? Only one attended the ARL Leadership Fellows out of 245. Two participants is
Correct.
surprisingly low.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
interested to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay. Let's start this presentation at the very beginning as to why I think that has happened. I think there are lots of different reasons for that. Unfortunately, that's, by the way, whoever that is, will you please contact me, because I'm actually initiating research that is very, very similar to this. So I would love to have a conversation with you. Yeah. I think it's about again, it's related to culture, right? It's related to opportunities. Unfortunately, there does seem to be what is it? It's a barrier, a closure in that highway to senior leadership. We ARL has a mid-career leadership development program. It was actually their first formal leadership development program, established in 1997 specifically for mid-career librarians from minoritized populations. And exactly in the 23 years of that program, so far only 3 participants in that program have become ARL directors, have come, although more have led other types of institutions. I think that it is deeply involved with systemic bias in terms of what we think of, what our communities think of readiness for leadership. And I think we need to have a serious conversation about what we need to do to counter that phenomenon. Yep, absolutely.
Okay, great. Another question. Libraries have
Yep.
traditionally played an important role in providing diverse and equitable access to content, books, databases,
Hmm.
and to physical spaces, printing stations, computer labs, et cetera. And recently, of course, we've learned about algorithmic bias in
Right.
systems such as discovery layers. What do you think about the role of academic libraries to further support DEI initiatives in higher ed?
Well, so I think that I think that libraries are in fact perfectly positioned to support the strategies and of the broader institutions, the broader university, and even thinking beyond that, if we want to think about community engagement and there are a lot of reasons for that. Part of that is because of the interdisciplinary nature of what it is that we do, right? We don't serve just the engineering community. We don't serve just the veterinary medicine people, students and faculty. We serve them all. And so thinking about that, both the synergy that we have, and looking for those opportunities to both support those broader institutional, university, college level strategic objectives, I think is absolutely critical. I also think that we have a lot of work to do in our own house, right? So in order to do that in an authentic way, we need to turn that lens inward and think about, okay, let's talk about descriptive practices, okay? Where is bias embedded in our descriptive practices? Can we do something to fix that? So, it's not that we should be perfect, and we will never be perfect. But if we can show intentionality and we can show behaviorally the changes that we are trying to make to change organizational culture, and most importantly, because organization culture is just so unapparent in most instances, to change the experiences of minoritized and otherwise marginalized people who work and take advantage within our institutions and take advantage of our services, then I think we have a stake in the ground, and we have some real estate to claim in terms of the contributions we can make to those efforts.
Thank you, Mark. I don't see any more other questions in the chat, and I think I would like to take a moment for everyone to just thank Mark for his presentation today and for all of the work that he's doing in this area. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. Absolutely. And by the way, I want to change the format on this to put this on our Purdue template, Clarence, and I always run out of time. So yes, I do have my own sort of consulting agency, but it's very, very small. This is my Purdue email address. And so if you have other questions or would like to follow up, I certainly welcome that. And thanks again for the opportunity, and thanks for your presence here today.
Okay, and I would just like to say as we part that the video of this presentation, just as there was for Mark's first presentation in February, will be made available. And I've also copied the chat, and the chat, because there's really some fantastic links that people have been popping into the chat,
Great.
we'll make that available as well. And I would also like to thank all of you for coming and participating today.